Hi, welcome back to my channel. I wanted to start making tutorial adjacent videos in the new year, so I wanted to walk you through kind of my average art process digitally. Now, I'm not going to be going over drawing fundamentals here, like how to draw a person and whatnot, but this is more so the workflow from taking a sketch and then bringing it all the way to final. It goes without saying that this isn't the only way to do this. This isn't even the only way I do it. I end up changing my process a lot from piece to piece and over time. Also, the process for painting backgrounds or objects or environments versus character illustration can look really different. But this is the kind of video that I wish I had when I was just starting out with more painterly techniques with my digital art, so I hope you find it useful. If you find that you don't want to follow any of these steps, though, you don't have to. I'm going to be trying to use beginner-friendly language throughout, but if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave them in the comments. Also, if you want to see more specific tutorials and whatnot, feel free to leave those too. And like and subscribe if you haven't already. Alright, let's get into it. So I'm using Procreate for this piece, but this won't be a program exclusive video. You should be able to do most, if not all of these things in any program. I started out with a sketch I did on paper, which I scanned in using a flatbed scanner, but you could also just take a photo of a sketch if you wanted to. And I went ahead and cleaned up the lines digitally on a new layer. This is basically my line art, but I'm not worrying about if my lines are perfectly clean or confident or whatever, because we'll be painting on top later as well. I also tweaked some parts about the original sketch, like the background and the sleeve, just generally getting the character and the environment ready to go. This is my character Ree, also, forgot to mention that. I did these lines with black so I can see them easily, but because they're on their own layer, you can always change the color later. A good thing to think about before adding in any color is what sort of vibe you're going for. In my case, Ree's at a cozy little diner, so I want to keep the colors warm and fuzzy like a film photograph. If you want something a bit more somber or cold, you can lean toward cooler colors. Color theory is its own whole other video, so I'm not going to dive too deep here, but just generally thinking about the vibe you're trying to capture can help with picking colors. The first thing I do before I add any specific colors is to change the background color. If your program doesn't have a built-in background layer, you can just add a layer below the line art filled in with one solid color. I like doing this because the white can just be so harsh and makes it harder to pick other colors. Picking a color here helps with that vibe setting I was just talking about. Since Ree's main color is pink, I went for a light peachy color. Generally for portraits, I tend to go for warmer colors, beiges and oranges and yellows and pinks, but feel free to use whatever color you like here. The next step is to create a silhouette of my character on a new layer underneath our line art and above our background. This is so that we can use some other little tricks later, but I'm just taking the selection tool and working my way around the entire perimeter of my character. I'm not worrying about the background stuff yet, I just want her to be on her own layer. In some programs like Clip Studio Paint, there's quicker ways to do this, but in Procreate, using the selection tool is my preferred method. This way, as opposed to coloring it in by hand, you don't have to worry about any gaps from missing spots or any texture from the brush you're using. Once I have the whole silhouette selected, I'm filling it in with a more saturated pink. The exact color doesn't matter here, we just want something distinct from the background color. I went ahead and created another layer and did the same thing for the background elements, the table and the booth she's sitting on. For me, this layer is underneath the bright pink we just did. If you have any elements overlapping the character on top, I'd recommend doing this same sort of filling step with those as well. I filled in the background stuff with a deeper pink to separate it from the character color. The darkness and the dullness also help push it back further in space. My selections were a bit sloppy for this stuff, so I colored in some extra bits by hand. Now we're going to start adding in some flat colors. We're not worried about lighting or shadows or anything just yet, just sort of the base colors for all the parts. To do this, I'm creating a blank layer on top of my fill but below my line art and making it a clipping mask layer by tapping on it and selecting clipping mask. The process can be different from program to program, but most have the ability to do this. You might just need to Google it. By making this layer a clipping mask, anything I draw on this layer will only show up in the areas I've painted on the layer below. So as I'm adding in the skin color and the hair and the clothing colors, the colors won't go outside of the silhouette I already made. You can have each element, like the skin, the hair, the clothes, etc., be on their own clipping layer if you'd like, but for me, I find it easier to just have everything on the same layer. If you're unsure of the exact colors you want to use, though, I recommend separating everything out on their own layers. It makes it a lot easier to edit the colors that way. You can do the same selection tool thing we did before with the silhouette, but for me, I'm just coloring it in by hand. It's not as effective, but it's a bit more fun. I created a new clipping mask on top of my last one to start adding in some details on Ree's sweatshirt. I knew I wanted to add stripes on the sleeves, and doing this on its own layer makes it a lot easier because you can erase any stray lines without messing with the colors right around it. I also ended up using the smudge tool here a little bit to smooth out the texture on the stripes because I didn't want the texture to be so loud there. I'm using my own Procreate brushes here, except for the line art that was done with a different brush, but you can follow along with any brushes you like. I also did the stripes on their own layer because I wasn't sure what undertone I wanted them to have. I used the hue saturation value sliders to make it slightly more saturated and slightly more blue. I'm now going ahead and doing the same flat color step with the background elements. The very back, the wall, and the window are going to be on their own layer. I'm also not worrying too much about the colors I'm putting down because I can always tweak them later. But yeah, going in and adding in the warm colors for the booth and the table and the coffee on a clipping mask for the background layer silhouette. I made a new layer for the very back. I knew I wanted the walls to be a cream color, and then I wanted some sort of rural parking lot outside the window, but for now I'm just adding in some blues and grays. Right now, here's what all of my layers look like. From top to bottom, I have the line art, then the two flat color layers clipping onto the silhouette underneath it, then the flat color layer clipping onto the furniture layer, then the back wall layer, my sketch, which is turned off, but there just in case I want to see the original sketch again, and my background peach layer. The background layer is also nice because if I accidentally have any gaps in my coloring, it won't be white showing through, it'll just be pink. Now that there's colors on my whole canvas, I'm going to go ahead and start adding in some shadows. To do this, I'm creating a new layer on top of everything and setting it to linear burn. Now, I can make a whole other video talking about the nuances of adjustment modes and whatnot, but you could use multiply, color burn, linear burn, or even other layer modes like overlay or soft light to do this. I'm using linear burn because I want more dramatic, saturated shadows. Multiply is also a good mode to use for adding shadows, but generally they'll end up less saturated. I scribble over everything with a light pink, and then I go into my hue saturation value sliders again to adjust the colors to my liking. I scribble over everything just so I can see how my color looks across all of the flats. You could also use different colors for different sections, but I like to keep it more simple, at least at first. Once I have the color I want, I switch back to normal mode, eyedropper select the color, and then use that to add shading over the whole image. This isn't a tutorial about how lighting works and whatnot, maybe some other time, but for me, my main light source is kind of on the upper right side, almost where the camera is. I'm not following that super strictly though, I'm just adding shading where I think it fits. Now I'm going to start adding in some highlights. Before I add any really bright or specific highlights, I like to start really subtle and fuzzy. To do this, the first thing I'm going to do is tap on my silhouette layer for the character and select. Now I'm creating another new layer and setting it to overlay. The reason why I selected the silhouette layer is so that when I add in all of this fuzzy nonsense, it'll stay just on the character and not go onto the background stuff. I'm using a medium brownish orange and highlighting the right side of the character, well, her left, our right. This gives us a nice warm glow. With a desaturated light bluey gray, I'm making my brush a bit smaller and adding in a bit of rim lighting from the window on the left side. This helps it feel like the overcast lighting from outside is coming through and hitting your cheek. Deselecting my selection, I'm now going to add in some other fuzzy lighting. I took a lighter brown and added it around the character to lighten up some of the furniture slightly. I'm also adding in some darker brown along the bottom and right edges to give it that sort of Polaroid feel. Here, I want to make all of the colors feel a bit more cohesive, and to do this, I'll be using a layer and some blending modes. I'm filling this new layer in with dark pink for now, and flipping through all the blending modes to see what works best. This is really subjective, there's not a right or wrong way to do this. I'm also using the hue, saturation, value sliders again to adjust the color of this layer. For this piece, the right solution ended up being a medium brown layer set to hard light at around 30% opacity. Now I'm creating a new layer on top, setting it to soft light, and I'm going to start adding in more specific highlights. I'm using my gouache-ish brush set to a beigey color and going through and brightening specific areas. I'm not adding it everywhere, but I'm trying to pull certain things forward. Like I said, the main light source is kind of where Rhea is looking, so I'm adding my highlights with that in mind. Some of the edges end up being a bit too harsh for what I was going for, so I'm using the smudge tool with that same gouache-ish brush to soften some of the edges. I honestly don't use the smudge tool a lot, but it does have its occasional uses. You can see me also do this on some of the background shadows just to fuzz them out a bit. Here, I'm going on another layer to boost the glow from the window behind her. I'm using a really soft brush with a bluey gray color and then adjusting the blending mode after. For this piece, color dodge ended up being a good fit. I'm using the eraser tool to erase some of the excess glow that I don't want on there. You can also see me turn it on and off just to see if I actually like how it looks. I recommend doing this throughout the process, seeing if the stuff you're doing actually is helping or if you don't like what you're doing. I'm now revisiting the soft light layer from before and adding in some more harsh highlights with a brighter cream color, mainly just on her cheek and on her sleeve. I'm also creating a new linear burn layer on top of everything to add in some deeper shadows. I'm not going to cover all the shadows I did before, but just deepening them in some specific places. We are eventually going to be painting on top of this, so I'm trying to set myself up for success later. I adjust the light purple that I'm using to be more warm or cool depending on the area I'm shading. I'm doing some last minute adjustments before I start painting over everything. The first thing I'm doing is adding in a lighten layer and filling it in with a dark color. This is a totally optional step, but since I was trying to emulate the sort of film photo look, I wanted my darks to not be completely black. So by using a lighten layer with a dark reddy orange at about 80%, it lightens my darks to be that reddy orange color and just gives it a bit of a softer look. I also changed my mind about the darker border and wanted to add a lighter one instead. I do this on another layer with a soft brush and play around with the blending / opacity / hue saturation value sliders until I like it. For the actual painting step, I swiped 3 fingers down to get the copy and paste menu, copied all, and pasted on top. You can do this in other programs too, but that's just how you do it in Procreate. This is essentially everything I've done so far flattened onto one new layer. You could also actually merge the layers together and flatten it that way, but I like to do this so that in case I want to revisit a separate layer for whatever reason, they're all still there. I am using some color balance sliders to adjust the colors a little bit, making it a bit more pink and purple instead of really warm like red and orange, but now I'm going to start painting. You can make a separate layer if you want, but I'm just going right on that copied all layer I made. With that same gouache brush, I'm going to go through and paint in some extra details, neaten things up, basically just kind of finish everything. This is definitely something you can do to taste. Honestly, you could even leave the image the way it was before and call it done. You don't have to do all this painty stuff. But in my case, I want to paint over some of my sketch lines, basically all the non-essential ones, with other colors, continue working on the shadows and highlights, and adjust the forms. You can see me flip the canvas here and adjust where the eye and eyebrow are. I honestly think a lot of people overhype the importance of flipping your canvas. You really don't need to do it constantly, in my opinion. It just helps you see things from a new perspective. In this case, from this new perspective, I thought the eye closest to us felt a little bit off, so I adjusted it. I will also say, though, that there will be times where you work on something, step away from it, come back to it, and not love what you did. For me, I don't like how I adjusted the mouth and the eye color here. You'll see in the finished image, but I ended up changing those again while I'm writing this voiceover. Taking time and space away from your art can help if you feel like you're hitting a roadblock but can't figure out exactly what it is. But yeah, I find it hard to explain exactly what I'm doing, but I'm using varying pressure because the brush that I'm using has pressure opacity and just sort of scribbling around between colors to blend them. I'm also eyedropper selecting colors to blend them into the surrounding areas. In some places, I'm using the colors that are already there, and then in other cases, I might introduce lighter or darker or more saturated colors to help get the look I'm going for. It's really a subjective process. The amount of quote-unquote rendering you do and when it's deemed quote-unquote done is really up to you. My favorite part is usually the face, so I end up starting there and then I kind of work my way out until I've done a pass of painting and blending and rendering on everything. And I'm using rendering as a sort of catch-all word here. There's not a specific right or wrong way to render. There's some areas where I'm completely covering up the lines, but then there are others where I'm keeping the dark lines intact. I'm still going for a bit of a cartoony look, so the lines help with that. If you were going for a more realistic or naturalistic look, you'd want to cover up any harsh lines completely. But yeah, just going around, adding stuff here and there. I also frequently turn this layer on and off to see how it looked before. I feel like I have a tendency to over-render and do too much to the point where it looks worse than it was before. If this happens, I'll try to simplify the rendering to match more closely with the base that I started with. Also recommend taking breaks frequently. Helps with the eye strain, wrist strain, all that physical health stuff. These clips were recorded in around 30-minute chunks, and between these all, I got up, got some water, took care of myself basically. Recommend doing it at least every hour, if not every half hour. Anyways, moving on to rendering the sweatshirt, I'm kind of freewheeling the folds here, but if you're unsure of how to go about adding folds, I recommend looking at photo reference, either taken by yourself or by somebody else. I recommend that for literally anything you're unsure of how to draw also. We love photo reference here. But yeah, you'll see me do a bit more smudging here along with using that same gouache-ish brush I've been using for this step. Like I said, not usually a smudge tool guy, but I found it useful here for getting that sort of base gradient of the shadows down, so then I could go on top and add more specific colors in. I tend to lose focus once I've moved off of the face, honestly, but that's something I've been trying to work on. You'll also see me zoom in and out frequently. I zoom out to be able to see the whole image at a glance and assess how it's going. Sometimes when you're really zoomed in, you might be working on one area too much, and then when you zoom out, all that hard work isn't even visible from where people are going to see it. So definitely recommend zooming out and just kind of looking at everything while you're in this step. I find it helps me keep on track. Now I'm adding in a bit more detail to the background in that window. The amount of detail you add to something can correlate to how much attention people will pay to it. So since I want this parking lot to really recess into the background, I'm barely adding any details to it, just enough to kind of convey some trucks or structures or something. I also smudge this up to push it back even further. I end up smudging a lot of the background elements right on the border of the image. Again, I think this helps with that sort of photo look I was going for, but also it just helps draw the eye into the center because I want people to look at Ree and not as much at the napkin holder on the table. I do want everything to feel finished though, so I am spending time here to neaten up the coffee cup, some of the sugar packets and creamers, all of those little details. I'm not doing a whole lot here, but just a little bit. If you spend a lot of time on one part and no time on another part, people will usually be able to notice, so I definitely recommend spending at least a little bit of time on everything. I also added a little bit of steam from the coffee on a new layer, so that way I could smudge it out without smudging everything underneath it. I also use this new layer to finish up the blinds on the windows behind her, just adding a little bit more definition to them. Now the painting part is done. Like I said, I did go in after the fact to adjust the mouth and the eyes, but I'll save that for the very end. Now I'm going to add in a bit of texture. This is an optional step, but I love doing it. I can also do a more in-depth video about ways to add texture to your drawings since it's something people ask me quite frequently. Anyways, I'm starting out by using a really noisy brush on a new layer and adding in some white splatters and some black splatters. I'm then going to change this to a soft light layer, which adds a nice bit of grain on everything. On another new layer, I'm also going into my adjustments and adding a noise filter. If you do this on a layer with stuff on it, it'll add the noise to those marks, but on a blank layer, it just adds noise everywhere. I change it from single color to multicolor, so that way it's adding a bit of subtle color variation. I also put this on soft light and adjust the opacity to my liking. This is one of my favorite easy ways to add texture. The last texture I'm adding is actually in another file. I purchased a zine pack from someone on Etsy. I'll leave the link in the description, not sponsored or anything. And it came with this great paper texture file. So I'm copying all again using the copy and paste menu and heading over to that other file. Now I'm going to paste underneath the paper texture and boom, we have more texture. There are ways you can emulate this on your own, but again, that's for another video, I think. I add another overlay layer using this crayon fingerprint texture from another pack, and then after that, we're done. I'll flip through the layers now so you can kind of see the reverse process, but yeah, we did it. Woo! I hope this was a bit helpful or entertaining. Feel free to let me know in the comments or ask any questions. You can follow me everywhere at cryptozoology with a V, or on Tumblr, I'm One-Trum. If you make art using this, I'd love to see it. But beyond that, thanks for sticking out to the end. Thank you so much to my patrons, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye for now.